All right. Why don't we start with Jenna today and then go up to Gregory commits and then come back around? So, Jenna, take it away.
On the mute button. Yeah, I don't know if I've dropped my thoughts into the hypothesis today, and I don't see anybody else there, so I'm going to stop sharing those links unless somebody says, no, 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 we're just not there yet. We do actually still like it. So the main one that I think is worth bringing out loud is down near the bottom, where he says smart contracts have finally made decentralized registries possible. Possible. Oh no, sorry, I'm not looking at the wrong one. Um, see, me too, learning to use the tool. The Doctor's recent piece that's been going around about institutification, he gets credit for the good word. There's something naive in the argument that that managed hosts. I'm not doing this very well. Sorry. The last paragraph under, in case you're not really on it, on scaling networks is the one I'm looking at. That he implies that the managed hosts thing, the problem with managed hosts is that they'll centralize the network, and I'm thinking what Doctor says that that's unlikely. That seems naive. That the financial pressures will let them rope people in a way that I don't think that this piece gets to the bottom of. But then again, this piece is a year old, and there's no sense that he's suggesting that it's going to be easy to do. So how do we solve the many problems along these roads? I'm prepared to say that smart people are going to be working on this. I have a generalized thing about smart contracts, which, that's a cute name, but how do you actually make sure that they're smart? That every software that I use is problematic. Um, so really trusting that you can write a smart contract that is smart seems to me a little bit oversold most of the time. So if we're going in order, then I'm passing to Meredith. Hey, Meredith.
Hey, I just created an account on Hypothesis. Um, yeah, I don't, this reading did not do it for me. Uh, I don't think it was rich. I'm curious, I'm curious, uh, I'm curious why it was selected. I was really, I was reading the whole part on novel social primitives. That sort of, I guess that stuck with me. And I found it sort of depressing um, that status is the core reason is the role of status. It seemed to be a bias, a cognitive bias on behalf of the writer. Anyway, that's my thoughts. Shrita.
I think Srida said she won't be able to speak till 8:30. So,
Sorry,
I,
Venkat, I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm here.
oh, okay, then go ahead,
My
Srida.
bad. I guess I don't know. Trying to think. I mean, I thought it was a pretty straightforward read. I guess my biggest like skepticism around decentralized social networks like Farcaster is adoption. Like, I wonder if for the median Twitter user, the level of like chaos is and agency required to like navigate this field of I guess like multiple clients and different levels of features per client. It's just like too much. And I mean, I don't know, like I hope this is not the case. Maybe there will be a larger, it feels like in order for something like this to succeed there has to be like a larger cultural like conscious shift. Maybe that actually is happening, or at least like obviously the door to it has opened with people seeing what's going on with Twitter, and maybe like more broadly overall with declining trust or something in institutions. But that is one thing I worry about. I also think in parallel, like if constraints are kind of necessary for the game theoretics of any like social platform to really take off and for people to know how to play the game and win the game. Like I do think the status stuff is important in that it just like recognizes a very base like primitive social need that people have and motivation for using these platforms. And I feel like understanding how the Twitter algorithm works or whatever is like actually what allows some people to play that game. I'm not really arguing about the moral correctness of it, just like in terms of adoption. So yeah, I don't know, like the level of agency required to like play this free market game is like the one thing that I am skeptical of. Oh, and I would be curious to also like read something from like Lens Protocol. I was doing like a job interview last week for XMTP, and um they like do backend infrastructure for sending and receiving messages. And I think it's really cool. Like they are built for the long term to be used for any kind of application, and Lens Protocol uses them. And I asked about Farcaster, and they feel like there's like a little bit too much of like a benevolent dictatorship happening in Farcaster. So I don't know. I don't know if that's true or not. Just flagging that I would be interested in reading about like how other decentralized social networks are approaching this problem. I will pass it to Steven, I think.
Yeah, so I read it last night. I thought the article was really well written, actually, from a technical standpoint. Provided a pretty good summary of how Farcaster really worked. I particularly highlighted the bold. I like the bold part where it says the ability to claim a unique username, post messages under that name, and read messages under that valid name. Be pretty core to the article to me. Yeah, in terms of like a discussion article, I'm not sure what to bring up particularly from the exact article. For me, like thinking about decentralized social networks in general is just like how do you make money out of it, and that's my core question around it. I think I remember hearing a podcast about Farcaster saying that they would end up giving cosmetic items or something like that and charge money for that. I guess that might work. I'm curious about if there's any other ideas. But yeah, in terms of Venkat's question, what do people actually want? Uh, I think that's hard to say. I mean, status is one thing. I think that's one thing that I think is likely true. But I'm sure there's other things too. I haven't thought too hard about that, but realistically, I think people are not willing to give up the ease of a centralized platform. So yeah, I think given the need for a lot of people for a social network to kind of work, I feel like crypto kind of works against that because of the affordances. So it's kind of like two forces kind of against each other. So I'm not sure how big it can end up being. At least that's what I think. But yeah, those are my thoughts. I guess going down Venkat.
Right. Yeah, I guess this was sort of a tricky read. On the one hand, it's coming from the CTO of Farcaster, so it's got the uh, depth of experience of building one of the few actual examples of this sort of thing out in a significant way. But on the other hand, it seems like super early days yet. And even though this is a year old, it still seems to be about a future that's at least 3 or 4 years away. So it's like we're not yet at the point where the hypotheses here are capable of being tested. Um, but the specific reason this sort of occurred to me as a good read is yesterday or day before, I think there was a big blow up on Mastodon around the new Harry Potter game, I think. So there was some sort of big server with like 12,000 people, and they had some fight, social justice, culture war stuff over the new game. And it blew up, and the guy basically said he's sick of running the server and he's going to shut it down in May. So now 12,000 people have to go find a new server. And there were two takes on that I saw. So one on Farcaster itself, the founder Dan Romero tweeted or casted something like, "This is the reason ActivityPub is not a great protocol because this sort of thing can happen, and it's not realistic to expect individuals to run their own servers and so forth, right? So Mastodon is not actually socially easy to administer. Like technically, it's not that easy. I've tried running a Mastodon server. It's enough of a headache that I didn't want to do it. But socially, as in administration and moderation, is very significant. So I think that's what Dan was pointing out. And if a moderator gets sick, some people have to leave. But on the other hand, as people were pointing out, relative to Twitter, it's actually much easier. Like if this had happened on Twitter, there would have been nowhere else to go. Now, at least in a very systematic way, in 3 months, people can go find alternate servers. They can take their follower list and following list, and basically, it'll still be lossy and messy because some people will leave or whatever. But it's kind of like a relatively graceful failure. So that's, I think, what people said. And I was thinking about, all right, so if Twitter and Mastodon have those problems and neither is a satisfactory point in the trade-off, what does Farcaster bring? And as I understand it, Farcaster, first of all, has truly global names. So it's not something like, VGR, it's something .social, like an online, like an email address. It's literally just the one name that can be universal. And that seems to have like deeper implications. And the second, I think, is if you go the Farcaster route, I think the social administration challenge is much easier. Like running a hub, which they're releasing soon, it's sort of at one level equivalent to an email server or a Mastodon server. But it seems, as far as I can tell from early details, it's not something you socially administer. It's more like you're being one of the backup nodes. You're sort of setting history policies, and you're like maybe supporting a client or two, but you're not socially administering what's going on. At most, you might do like some overall blocks and stuff, but you're not responsible for running the community. And that makes sense because if it's closer to an email servers aren't set up to, like, there's no such thing as an email moderator who dictates what kind of conversations can be had on email, right? So socially, I think it's going to be somewhat easier. So that, I think, is kind of the background of this whole discussion. Now, on this particular article, yeah, I too was sort of impressed by the fairly strong claim that you need only these three affordances, namely the ability to claim a name, post under that name, and read anything in order to like sufficiently decentralize a network. And I think the idea of sufficiency here is enough that no one person can like dominate the network, or a benevolent dictator can like tell you what to do. So that criticism, I think, if they're true to their promise, it'll go away, which is once they start supporting hubs other than the main one that Farcaster itself runs, Dan and the others at Farcaster will no longer be benevolent dictators. Anybody can run a hub and sort of do other policies. So I think it's kind of an interesting vision. I think the technical hypothesis that this is all you need is untested, but there's good conceptual reasons to agree that that's all you need. But I think it's one of those necessary, but maybe not completely sufficient at like a social adoption level. So I think there's additional conditions you'll need to make things socially successful and adopted, and maybe status is one of them, maybe it's not. So the I don't know, cultural and social logic is not yet clear to me. And since Shrida brought up Lens protocol, I did sign up for that, and I have username on Lens, and I think it's much more like fragmented, and there's no central point of entry, so it's messier to know what to do, and nothing in particular has had traction as far as I can tell. But the one big difference from Farcaster is still on the test net, so there's no such thing as like name squatting and things going on, whereas Lens is already on mainnet, and one of the implications of that is your name is an NFT and people bid on it. So I don't actually use Lens protocol at all, but because the my name claimed is in my wallet on OpenSea, I randomly keep getting bids for people wanting to buy my name for like small amounts of ETH, and that gives you a little bit of a sign of the future. When Farcaster goes on mainnet, it's going to have the same problem. Like people are going to like compete for names. There's going to, I think they have a scheme where you pay a small fee every year to retain your name based on like activity or whatever. But yeah, names will become like some sort of like hijacking target, and it'll be like DNS where like valuable domain names become targeted and stuff. So early days yet, but yeah, I think this is kind of like I don't know. I think of it more as a report from the front lines of trying to make this happen. So anyway, sorry for going on. Going around to Anant.
Sorry, just took me a minute to unmute myself. Yeah, I thought it was a good article to considering Varun Srinivasan is one of the co-founders of Forecaster, like other people had talked about, and I found the definition of sufficient decentralization quite interesting. Just a unique name, post message, and be able to post messages with that name and read messages with that name. I'm not sure if that just those three aspects complete uh, the decentralization or the sufficient decentralization part. I can't think of other things yet, but it seems somehow incomplete in some way. And I sort of dug through their documents a little bit as for this reading and for my general curiosity, and read how they plan to run their hubs and how they plan to run their delta. So the way, if I understand it correctly, is they're trying to use a smart contract like similar to what ENS uses to issue names, but they run their network or sort of layer two on top of like a base layer, which will have these hubs and all the messages, interactions, and so on and so forth. I thought that was like Venkat just said, it's pretty novel and it's at the front lines of what people are trying to do. But the other question that I thought the article raised, which I thought was interesting, was like putting the entire social network on blockchain is not feasible, and it's not maybe even needed in some sense. So what's the balance between putting everything on chain, which is of course got a lot of technical challenges, to what can be done today? And that seems like a very interesting problem space, and Farcaster, at least the protocol, seems to take a shot at that. And another interesting piece for me was the novel social primitives, where I guess the article talks about different primitives that one can build, one can use, or build some status or reputation around. And it also talks about the communication primitives that the Facebooks and the Twitter and the Snapchats had, with each of them with their own unique sort of communication primitive, I guess. And I'm not sure what that would be for like a decentralized social network, or even a sufficiently decentralized social network. The problems of a centralized social network are usually felt by what I would consider as people on the edges, with either activists or people working on some cutting edge, often debatable signs and leading to inconclusive results, etc., etc. So those are the people that I think are most affected by the centralized power. So those might be the target audience that might be interested in this. And as far as the general public, or a general person that's not sufficiently in sync with all the different problems that a centralizing power might bring, I'm not sure what the value proposition could be. But it's an interesting it's an interesting approach nonetheless. And one thing that I did notice, people are talking about going from testnet to mainnet for Farcaster. At least in their documentation under Delta Graph, they say that if you register a Farcaster name connected to a well-known public person or entity, the name may be deregistered. And if you don't actively use it for 60 plus days, your name may be deregistered at our discretion. This, I'm assuming, is a result of a benevolent dictatorship going on right now, but I'm not sure. Again, it's be interesting to see how this scales once they allow other people to run hubs and maybe implement their own social policies on within those hubs. But overall, I thought like this was a good article that summed up the problems really well, but I felt it was a little short in the details of the solutions. But their documentation, of course, to be fair, has a lot more details about how they intend about going to build this. So that's just me. I'll pass it on to Anuraj.
Yeah, this article reminded me of that reading we had, I think, last year, the zero tier paper. I think it approached a similar problem from the other side, like how much centralization is needed to for decentralized network, and this seems to be a good read to go along with that, and how much decentralization is needed for a social network. So that was that one thought that came to my mind. And the other thought was that some people have already said that people are not going to like give up the features they already have on centralized networks. They go to centralized networks because it gives them some features and they want to use those features. And what was the other thought? Mm, Yeah, so like if Farcaster is going to compete with like right now it's almost seems like a Twitter clone, and like if it's going to be a Twitter clone, it's not going to take off very high, so it won't find too much adoption. So what I find interesting is like how much like you could interact with the network programmatically. So like I was already playing with the Python SDK for and posting on Farcaster already. So that is what interests me more in this, and what all new paradigms or like apps you can build on top other than just social networking by this protocol. That is what I found interesting. And passing on to Ben.
Hey, yeah. So I think this article is interesting. I believe I've read it before. I do love the definition he gives of sufficient decentralization, and I think it's very interesting to see how current social networks and I think Mastodon end up failing this. I think Mastodon tries, but I feel like Mastodon tries to decentralize the wrong things and ends up. And I linked a post about it's the worst of all possible worlds in some sense. Um, Precisely because if you look at like that recent collapse of a server, um, the amount of work people are going to have to do to actually get off it, and the amount of power this effectively random person they end up trusting with was very large relative to I think what could have been. Anyway, one thing this post I don't think goes into deep enough, and I would actually argue. Let's stop before I go into that. I would actually argue that the ENS sort of global. I'm not sure global names are necessarily that good. I've heard of these systems called pet name systems. Um, I'll try to drop some links on them. Basically, the TLDR of pet names is that they're almost like everyone can be their own DNS, but obviously it's not that simple or that complicated, really. The idea is less that you claim a name globally and more that you claim a name relative to say some group, and of course there would probably be some like major group like that operates kind of like DNS. But the idea being that it's with centralized the sort of DNS/ENS thing. There's a lot of problems with like how do you get the name, make sure people get their names effectively, and how do you prevent them from losing their names to scammers, and how do you stop squatting and all this kind of very technical, very economic, very honestly I would say unproven. We've never actually found a great solution to this that everyone likes. It's almost like a form of governance it's very hard. So, and I've always found pet names fascinating in that hopefully you can try to work around this some way. But I don't want to go too deep into that. Just wanted to sort of mention it so people were aware it existed. One of the things this post doesn't talk about is I don't think it talks enough about how email failed. It mentions email as a sort of a decentralized social network sort of thing. And I think that maybe was true 20 years ago. But I think at this point, email is no longer decentralized. It's fully centralized under a small group of, at least email people actually use, like my Gmail account. It is not a decentralized network anymore. It's completely been captured by the big players. And I think that the thing with email is you had sort of two fundamental problems. One is that there's really no you're relying everything is public effectively. It's almost like a blockchain in the sense that at least the owners of the server can read your emails because they're not encrypted, and you can try to encrypt them with PGP, but that has like the worst possible UX as people have figured out. But yeah, there's effectively no way to secure your own emails against using the service you're using, which at this point there's no possibility of running your own service. And there was spam, and that really seems to have been the death knell of it. And it's I think very interesting to look at how spam destroyed email, and sort of returned to the sort of hosted provider, in a way that basically no one can really add another hosted provider to it very easily without many tens of millions of dollars. And I think that problem could have been solved if the email was designed a bit more cleverly. I don't want to drag this on too long since we're already going pretty long, but I do want to say, like I said, I'm not sure that's captured in the initial definition of ability to claim a unique username, post messages, and read messages from any valid name. That doesn't. He's thinking like spam and stuff. That can go on a higher layer. I think that's partially true in that I don't want I'm not sure a fully decentralized system can do spam correction or stop spam. But I'm not sure. I think that he has to be clever with this, because I think that if the base layer is too weak and doesn't have enough protections or tools or hooks or whatever built into it to actually build something usable, you're just going to end up in the email situation again. So yeah, I think I'm the last person. So we go back to Venkat.
No, there's like two more people after you, and I think Brian and Gregory are still to go. Brian.
Okay,
Gregory,
yeah, I'll pass it to Brian.
Yeah. I think this article, and I guess this is broadly my interpretation of the kind of alt social network crowd, is that they see the messages, the actual payload as the thing that makes a social network, and this article clearly called that out. And it's not like to me, social is about the connections. Like even if there is not a payload between my account and another account, and they're still connected, whether there is something regularly coming down the pipe, or once every 5 years there's like a handshake that maintains the relationship. That to me is social. Like that's how the real world works. That's how friendships and like person-to-person relationships work. So I think it's kind of to me it's a thin description of social networks. And I also I think if you're going to make it a little bit thicker, there's broadcast media, which is primarily what most people use social networks for. They're either, people love Twitter because they can get on it and they can grow an audience of tens or hundreds of thousands of people. And I think there's an assumption that everybody is entitled to that. And when there is some kind of rule by law thing going on where, some guy or a group of guys threatens to take away your access to broadcasts, people get a little creeped. But on the other side, there is like peer-to-peer, which is, I think, what email always has been and always will be. Is whether or not it's private, it's a peer-to-peer protocol. It's not a social network. I'm sure you can broadcast and you can send a whole list of people something, but it still originates from one account and ends up in another account. So I think I like step back to ask myself, like, why do I care so much about all this stuff, or like read and pay attention? And it feels to me like all of this blockchain stuff is laying the groundwork for whatever kind of networks we build for ourselves in the future, whether or not Farcaster takes off. Its experiment will either inform Farcaster taking off or inform some future iteration of this. So I think we're building, email protocols, RSS protocols, or replacement protocols for these kind of things. What else do I have here? Somebody, when we were talking about the Fediverse, the Mastodon thing, I think everybody rags on the Fediverse without realizing that is really how the real world is structured for the most part. I didn't have a fully formed thought, but like that is kind of, to me, holding up the mirror to the real world and saying, like, this is how you are. Whereas I don't think that, like, holding up the mirror moment has happened for Farcaster and all the blockchain crowd yet. Like, they're kind of off in their own world trying to make all of social life legible. So it'll be interesting to see how long they can defer that mirror moment, or if they can live in their own alt reality for quite some time. The last interesting point that I had that I'm glad I didn't miss was it feels like we're trying, like Web 2 social platforms, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, are an anomaly in human history, and we're taking that as like some kind of pinnacle of like, look, everybody can be connected to this one thing, and we can all talk to each other and have both peer-to-peer and broadcast media all in one place, and this is great. And then a decade later we're finding out the limits to that, and now like we're trying to use blockchain and other like network technologies to try to reverse engineer those big networks, and it feels to me like that can't be done, at least in the way that the utopian way that everybody hopes for. Like, I think the inverse of those big networks is like the thousands of years of human history that were non-digital. There's a lot of like rich relationships in social life that's just not, in a ledger somewhere. So that I think that covers my thoughts. I'll pass it to commits.
Thank you. So okay, a few points. I think in some ways, the kind of the like mental headspace around what social media is has just become too large. When we have articles like this that kind of come with the assumption that people want an audience, or that they want like a medium for success, or status as a service. I think that points in some senses to a need perhaps to bifurcate and disambiguate what we're talking about when we're talking about social media. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but on one hand, we might have social media, which is more oriented maybe towards um, entertainment and ephemerality, and then on the other hand, we might have something like social utility, which as cringy as it is, things like LinkedIn or like and I realize like kind of disambiguating those things is kind of impossible at this point because we're so acclimatized to having those things intertwined with each other. But I wonder if having some kind of disambiguation there could could help. Um, on the kind of Mastodon point that Venkat brought up, I think in some senses this speaks to a broader kind of just social phenomenon of people. I, I think like I don't know how to put this like concisely, but I think generally speaking, like we need to develop kind of cultural practices and rituals that allow us to kind of deal with the ephemerality of the internet, uh, or like realizing and coming to terms with the fact that like we're kind of conditioned in these centralized services to think that everything is like more or less permanently archived, which they're not. B, that things are immediately accessible, and that's kind of just like a general conception of how the internet works, even though again that's not the case. And C, like with things like ChatGPT, we're kind of trained into thinking that like all of information is like reducible and legible, when in fact like a lot of what is happening is just like a statistical averaging of like the most kind of common ways of kind of communicating information. And so I think like that lossiness that Venkat was talking about is something that it would be interesting to think of how we can attune ourselves to that and become more used to that, like that the experience of digital loss, like embracing the lossiness somehow. And I think about this sort of in terms of like with this kind of Twitter Mastodon kind of dichotomy that's been coming up in the last couple months. The the people like really want something that they can kind of cohere around in their headspace. So like Mastodon becomes that thing for them. Like the idea of Mastodon is centralized. Like the social headspace of that is centralized, even if the kind of technical implementation is federated. And so I think just the kind of broader question is like, is there a kind of like social media, application or context that would help desensitize us to that kind of like, or break us out of that kind of need for kind of centralized social coherency. Um, another two more thoughts briefly. I think with things like Matrix or Secure Scuttlebutt, I mean, a lot of the interesting things that are happening there is that they're making things that are beyond chat. So they're taking the protocol and doing things like annotation services, or there's one that does like a kind of like a data platform that helps communities capture and store and archive their histories. Um, I think when we think about things like blockchains and distributed databases and these kinds of services or infrastructures, the question is like what needs to actually be resilient. And I think also with something like Secure Scuttlebutt, I mean one of the benefits there is that it can be used offline. It's offline first, and then it kind of is it's eventually consistent because it's a distributed system, and there's a question with stuff like blockchain is like I think in some senses like the fact that it isn't able to be accessed in an offline manner, or maybe it isn't. I'm curious if it is, and I just don't know. Like that doesn't seem like a very useful long-term infrastructure if we kind of recognize that eventually we might find ourselves in a kind of ecological situation where like we actually really do need offline capable ways of sending and receiving data. So that's kind of like a broader point there. And then I think in terms of like the keys question with like the blockchain. I think it's useful because it kind of points to like the capabilities of a user, and I've been looking more at like object capability paradigms and capability paradigms in general. And I think I do like I like that's like the thing that is like placed on like the kind of resilient infrastructure level, not the content, but the thing that gives you the capability to do whatever it is that you want to do on the platform or through the protocol. So those are some of my thoughts, and I'll pass down the list to Gregory.
Okay, I will start with a prompt because there was a lot said before me. So I will try to answer the prompt and then add some additional comments. So the prompt was, what do people want? And for me, it's a tricky question because of an interest in asymmetry. Typically, what people want, they can't have. For example, we want a clean wall. We want a lot of friends, a huge audience. And we want an ability to direct our messages directly to the brains of our audience. It's pretty clear that it's impossible. You have to make trade-offs. And interestingly enough, people don't like to make trade-offs by themselves. They would rather rely on somebody else to make those trade-offs for them. So if you want to control relationship with your audience, it's an okay goal, but at the same time, how are you going to do it with thousands of people? So somebody have to give you some aggregation and segmentation tools. And apparently regular people are not going to build these tools themselves. And in addition to this, very few people would understand how to use this tool in a meaningful way. I appreciated Ben's comments about email. Can add to that that transition from email to social was very interesting because, in a sense, social was an upgrade compared to email. So, or at least it was considered this way. So, in a sense, decentralized should be an equal or bigger upgrade compared to social. So if you want decentralized social compared to centralized social, make sure that it is an upgrade. Some of the terms and definitions that article uses, in my view, are not very useful. For example, the idea of healthy network is not very productive. And the definition of sufficient decentralization is not very helpful. For the same reason, because they both misrepresent the idea why people join the network in the first place. People don't join the network because it's healthy. And they don't join a network because it's decentralized. There should be some benefit, some big benefit of joining the network. And having this benefit is probably more important than anything else. When we are talking about benefits and frustrations of social networks, as this article does, we tend to forget that we are talking about it after at least a decade of active use. And this decade changed our understanding of the social along the way. So both benefits and frustrations compound, in my view. So the current balance is interesting, so we are frequently frustrated. by what's going on Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn. But there was a particular sequence of events that led to the current state, and probably the sequence of events contains more useful information than just the current state. Finally, the key to the whole idea of building a better healthy, decentralized network, in my view, is in the new social primitives. That article is talking about, but they really have to be obviously helpful and obviously different. And because of that, I kind of doubt that this will be about status. Status was a game that Twitter and other social networks play. New players like Falcaster need to discover and play a different game. So that's my part. And I was a final person.
All right. We're a minute over, so no time for second round. But looks after sort of a little bit of a wobbly start, this turned out to be a pretty provocative discussion prompt. So I'll try to look for another one to continue the discussion next time along the same lines. So if anybody has suggestions for something to read that can continue this discussion, please post it in the channel. We'll pick one of those. All right. See you guys next week.
See you guys.